let's go through how you get cinematic footage with the DJI Flip. We're gonna use the Flip with the controller. That's gonna be the easiest way to control your drone, because when you're in the phone or you're just taking off from your hand, you don't have as much control, so you can't control your image, be able to make it look a little bit more cinematic. So I'm gonna use ND filters on the drone because I wanna bring my shutter speed to double that of my frame rate. It's gonna give us some motion blur. And motion blur is basically the blur that happens between frames. So if I was to freeze this right now, you can see my hand has some blur to it because I'm shooting at double that of my frame rate, which is 1/60th because I'm shooting at 30 frames per second. This is just like the standard for Hollywood cinematic looking footage. And in movies, this is what you typically see. If you were to shoot at a higher shutter speed, that could be used for like high action scenes, or if you really want to freeze frames. Now, flying a drone, you don't really need to shoot with this cinematic motion blur, but it does give you a little bit of a different look. And so if you don't need to capture each frame and need them super sharp, then if you want more of this cinematic look, you add the motion blur, it will make your footage stand out compared to the footage that doesn't have it. So let's figure out which ND filter that we want to put on here and get all of our settings dialed in. So the first thing I want to do is set up my frame rate. So I'm going to go 4K and let's shoot this at 24 frames per second. If you want to get that cinematic look, you might shoot at 24. A lot of times creators will say the look of 24 looks more cinematic, so we'll play around with that. However, you could go between 24 and 30. I personally use 30 for a lot of my work, but sometimes I do flip into 24 depending on what I'm working on. And then let's go over to, let's lock our white balance at 5600. And now let's go over to our exposure settings. So we're gonna do manual on both our ISO and our shutter, and we're gonna take our shutter down to 1/60th. And it's gonna be fully overexposed, and our ISO is gonna be lowest at 100. Now we're gonna throw on an ND filter, and it's probably gonna be a 64. That's what I have here. I have 16, 64, and 256. With the light where it's at in the sky, let's try a 64. And these ND filters just clip right in, and you'll hear it snap. All right, so now when I'm looking at this, it's showing that it's plus 0.3. I'm looking at it and nothing looks too crazy overexposed. However, if we point this direction, the footage does look pretty good. If we look towards the sun, it's gonna be overexposed. So you just have to kind of keep in mind when you're flying manual, which way you're gonna wanna point. But this ND filter looks like good for the kind of shot that I'm gonna get, because how I wanna fly is not directly into the sun and not directly where the sun is pointed. I wanna kind of have the sun off to the side. So this looks perfect. So let's get the drone in the sky. Now the key with cinematic footage is not being super jerky with the joysticks. So oftentimes I'll stick it into cine mode and I'll create smooth movements with the scene that I'm flying. Now having settings might make your footage look cinematic, but really it comes down to time of day and how you fly the drone. So right now the sun is getting lower in the sky. It's pretty far on the horizon. You see these big long shadows sweeping across the landscape. And when you pair that with manual settings, you can have lots of contrast in your scene. Contrast is a big thing that's gonna make your footage look different than shooting midday with just sun blasting everything in the distance. So oftentimes when you see really cinematic looking footage, it's morning, evening, right? Then the sun's coming up or right when the sun's going down. And I think that alone, beyond the settings, like no ND filters, shooting at whatever frame rate that you want, doesn't matter if you have your time of day correct and you're getting some really interesting shadows and you're using light in different ways to be able to paint the landscape. You gotta think of the lighting that you see as a paintbrush, and you are a painter, so you're an artist. So you use lighting to create your work of art. And when you think of it in that way, you wanna start finding different ways to creatively use the light and how it hits different objects and how it brushes across the landscape. And when you start seeing shadows and you see this contrast between light and dark, that's where you really see some good looking footage. Now you pair that with smooth drone flying and you'll get some great looking footage. So when you're flying to get footage that looks really good, what you want to do is slow, and you want to be very consistent, and you want to be direct with your movements. So you don't want to be like flying all willy-nilly all over the place, but rather if you want to have a shot of, say, this mountain over here, maybe it's just a shot going straight forward towards the mountain, or maybe it's a straight shot going backwards. Or if you want to create an orbit, maybe an arc around. Another thing I really like to do is reveals. So I'll go down low behind an object and then come up over that object and reveal the landscape in the distance. And I like to use these reveals and use layers. A big thing for me to get good looking footage is taking advantage of creating multiple layers. So if you have mountains, if you have different hills or different buildings in the way, if you can create separation and have the light hitting these different layers in the distance between what's foregrounded and what's way out in the distance, you can get some really good footage. And then one other thing you can do that's gonna make it even smoother is shoot at 50 or 60 frames per second and then slow it down. So if it's a 24p timeline, shoot at 50, slow it down half speed. If you're doing a 30 frames per second timeline, just do it 60 frames and do it half speed, and you'll get even smoother footage when you're out flying. Those are some tips on how to get cinematic looking footage when you're out flying. And yeah, pretty sunset. It's awesome.
Now, my last tip to get cinematic footage is to shoot in D-Log-M. On the DJI Flip, when you're in D-Log-M, you're recording 10-bit 420 footage, and shooting in log gives you less contrast and less saturation, which allows you to do some color grading. So here is what the shot looks like straight out of my drone. Now, I'm gonna bring this into my editing software, and there's two different ways that I'm gonna go through and edit this footage. First, I'm gonna just do it quickly using LUTs, and LUTs are a pre-made color profile that color grades your footage fast. And so I do this in a two-step process. First, I do a conversion LUT. So there's a D-Log-M to Rec. 709 that gives you a standard look. And then second, I would add a creative LUT. So I'm gonna add the LUT that I've created called Rwanda, which was built when I went and did a documentary in Rwanda. And I'm gonna bring down the opacity of this LUT until it looks good. Now, this is the quick way to do color grading. To do this manually, I would go back to the original D-Log-M footage, and then I'm gonna pull up my curves and I'm gonna add contrast. So I'm gonna pull down the darker parts of the image, pull up the brighter parts of the image, and then I'm gonna add some saturation. So this is bringing it to that standard look. Now from here, I can go through and pull up my HSL curves or my color wheels and start tweaking the colors until I've created a look that I think looks good for the scene. Now, if you want to deep dive into color grading with D-Log-M footage, I have that here on my channel. I'll link to it down below in the description. And the biggest thing when it comes to color grading, you just want to go through and make sure that all your shots are synced so they all look similar and you don't have crazy colors going from one shot to the next. Now, if you want to see every feature that's packed into the DJI Flip, I did a complete beginner's guide that goes through every single feature, and you can find that right here. So I'll see you on the next one. And remember, don't forget to subscribe and like this video.